Welcome back to the Mildew Twang Outdoors podcast, where we chronicle our time spent in the Delta, the swamps, the piney woods, and beyond. Here, we share our experiences and stories, ranging from simple country living to lesser-known stories of American culture and what all of this means for us as Christians in today's world. Last week, you had the opportunity to hear about a raggedy old pair of coveralls and how that clothing item initiated my entrance into the historic fraternity of outdoorsmen. You listened to the story of my wife killing her first mature buck deer in the Palmetto Flats of the South Alabama Delta. We were able to look at these life-changing moments in light of eternity and how, even though the way may seem unclear to us, we are affected by everything around us. Please welcome back my father, Tim Caldwell, aka Papa Nichols, as we relive a couple moments from both of our lives that shaped our outlook on the value of life. We will also discuss this past deer season and some of our key takeaways and lessons learned, including some tidbits about understanding wind patterns and whether cover scent is worth the hassle. Thank you, Dad, for joining me again on this podcast.
Sure, glad to be here. As always, it's a great day to talk about the great outdoors.
It sure is. So I'll tell you this, last week we talked about Brittany's first deer. And I know that while you and Mama both celebrated her kill with us afterwards, you were not directly involved in that whole ordeal. So today I want to dig into the story of your first deer and see just how that situation played out. From what I remember, that story was a doozy. And after your story, we might dig into my first deer killed in Natchez, Mississippi, before we move on to the current season and all of the situations that we faced.
Sounds great.
Now that we've got the introductions out of the way, tell me about your first deer. I remember you had an old 30-30 with iron sights, but that's about it.
Yeah, I sure did. You know, I hunted several years before I ever killed a deer. And my older sister married a guy named Ray Mathis. And Ray's dad was named Jesse Mathis. And they hunted for meat. I mean, they hunted for subsistence. They lived off the meat that they killed. And I hunted with them for, 2 or 3 years before I ever actually killed a deer. They were big into dog hunting. They loved to run dogs. And, you know, I can still hear the dogs as plain as day right now. It's a great sound when you're in the woods and you hear the dogs coming towards you. And, you know, the deer's in front of them. And before it was over, I did kill several deer in front of the dogs. But my first deer was just happenstance. I had an aunt and uncle named Judy. Mitch was my uncle, Mitch Lundy, and Judy Lundy lived outside of Grenada, Mississippi. Mitch was a big lawyer there in Grenada, and he was an avid outdoorsman. I learned how to duck hunt in the Delta and got to deer hunt with them, stay at their house and deer hunt with them many times. But this one particular weekend, my brother-in-law Ray and I were in Grenada. And before we went, my mom and dad gave me a brand new Marlin 30-30 with iron sights on it, lever action. And I was excited to take it to the woods. I never owned a real deer rifle before. That was my first one. So anyway, Ray and I drive up to Grenada, get there late one night. And I think it was the next morning we get up and again, my Uncle Mitch and Aunt Judy lived out in the middle of nowhere outside of Grenada, and you could walk out the door and just about shoot a deer right outside I guess you could call it a yard. What I liked about hunting there too was Aunt Judy would always have breakfast for us. We'd leave the house before daylight and we'd walk 100 yards, 200 yards, didn't have to go far to sit down in the woods and wait for a deer to come by. And if nothing came by about 8 or 8:30, we'd find our way back to my aunt's house and eat breakfast to head back out around 9 or 9:30. But anyway, this particular morning, Ray and I were out there and we sat and we hunted for a while and neither one of us saw anything. And we got back together and started easing our way through the woods. And we decided to split. We had a ridge that we were looking at, and Ray was going to go on the right side of the ridge, and I was going to go on the left side, and we were going to see if we could jump a deer and run it out on the other one, run it out over each other. So we split up, and Ray started easing around the bottom of the ridge. I started easing to my left, and I took about 15 steps, and I looked up, and I saw this little basket rack rubbing a tree. And he was just going up and down, and I pulled that 30-30 Marlin to my shoulder and got my iron sights on him, and I squeezed the trigger, and that little buck hit the ground. He was probably about 60 yards from me. Never had any idea I was there. He still doesn't know I was there. I mean, he never knew what hit him. But as soon as I pulled the trigger, I looked up, and here comes Uncle Ray. He's like, "What in the heck did you do?" I said, "Well, I just shot a deer right up the hill there." "No, you didn't. You couldn't have. We just split up." I said, "Yeah, I did too. I did. It's right up there." "Well, come on, let's go see." So we started easing our way up there, and sure enough, it was a little 6-point basket rack, had 4 points on one side and a forked horn on the other. And I think he'd been injured on one side at some point, and that's why his rack was screwed up like that. But we got to looking, and I shot through a little tree that was about 3 inches in diameter, I guess, and I hit that little buck in the neck. So we get up there and we check it out, and he's excited, but he's also a man's man, and he looks at me and he says, "Well, now you got to get it back to the house." And I'm sitting there wondering how am I going to do that? But anyway, I ended up throwing that deer across my shoulders and hiking my way back up to my aunt's house while Ray carried my gun. But it was a good time.
It sounds like you were a man's man.
I was working on it. Killing your first deer is like you know how girls never forget the first kiss? Guys never forget killing their first deer.
That's true. Absolutely. Yeah, I know I've killed 60, 70. I don't know. I've killed a bunch. I don't know how many you've killed, but what would that number look like?
I have no idea. I lost count a long time ago.
Yeah, I remember 3 or 4 deer from my hunting career specifically that stand out. The first one I killed with a rifle. The first one I killed with a bow. And there were a few that are special that are interspersed in there for different reasons, but most of them run together.
Yeah, they do. I remember my first bow kill too.
What happened with that deer?
I was going to school at Mississippi State University in Starkville, Mississippi, and I had a buddy that was a big target archery shooter and loved to hunt. And he actually had a 14 target range outside his apartment through the woods, and I would shoot with him just about every day. But opening deer season rolled around, and we were always competitive with anybody we could compete with. And as the opening day deer season was coming around, we were bragging on how we're both going to kill a buck that day. And again, it was archery season, so it was probably early October. It came, and he and I got up and left Starkville about 4:00 in the morning, drove to Meridian, Mississippi to his deer camp. And I didn't see anything that morning. He killed a small buck, and we made our way back to Starkville, got there about noon, and met up with our buddies, and they were all laughing. You said y'all were both going to kill one. You only brought one back, and it's a small one. And we're like, well, we still have this afternoon, so we haven't lost out yet. So I guess it was about 1:30, 2:00. We drove down to the Noxubee Refuge, National Wildlife Refuge, just south of Starkville. And we parked, and you couldn't drive on the refuge. You could only drive on the roads. But anyway, we parked, we gathered our stuff, and we took off. And we walked, and we walked, and we walked. And we finally got down in this bottom in a swamp. And we had our climbing stands with us, and he stopped, and I kept going probably another 200 yards. and I found me a little island out in that swamp. And I put my stand on the tree and I started climbing. And I probably got, I don't know, 25, 30 feet up off the ground. And I'm up there getting situated and I hear something coming. And I look down and it's a decent little buck, probably an 8 point, came right under my stand. And I whistled, but it never paid any attention. I guess the leaves were too loud that day. But anyway, I went ahead and grabbed an arrow and knocked an arrow. And about that time, I saw a bigger rack. He had to duck his head to come under a fallen tree. So he ducked his head and came out from under the tree. And this time I hollered loud enough for him to hear me. And he stopped probably 5 yards from the base of the tree. And I drew on him and I shot the arrow and I knew it hit him because, the arrow went slap through him and was laying there on the ground, had the bright blood on it. And he turned and ran maybe 50 yards and I heard him crash. And, my buddy, who was, 100, 200 yards from me, heard the shot and heard the hit. And, at that time, that smaller buck, which was still a decent buck, had come within range of him. And he sat there waiting for that buck to fall. He had a shot on it, but he wouldn't take it because he knew I had a good hit. And eventually that buck walked off and I sat there till dark hoping he would get a shot. And anyway, dark came and he came up there and he's like, "What'd you do?" I said, "Well, I killed a pretty good buck. He's right over there. I heard him crash." We went over there and sure enough, it was a nice 10 point that I've got hanging on the wall now.
That's a beautiful deer. I've been jealous of that thing since I was a kid.
Yeah, it was a good one. The fun part is going into the woods and climbing, sitting in your stand, watching the deer, shooting the deer. The part that's not so much fun comes after you kill the deer. That deer, we were probably 2.5 miles from the truck and we couldn't take a 4-wheeler in. We couldn't take anything in. Carrying that deer 2.5 miles to the truck was a chore, but it was worth it. We got back to the apartment probably around 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning.
Man, that's a little further back than I've had to drag one.
Yeah, it is. But, sometimes hunting public property too, sometimes you got to go a little further to get where the deer are.
You killed your first bow deer way back on Noxubee County Refuge. So how did you know where to set up? Had you been to that place before?
My buddy had scouted it hard and heavy. He actually got to Mississippi State the year before I did, and he had scouted it out. He found an area of the refuge that backed up to a soybean field. And so we were catching those deer as they were coming in and out of that soybean field.
Man, we don't have any soybeans like that here in South Alabama, as you very well know.
Yeah, we're going to this summer though, because I'm fixing to plant.
Now, we don't need to spend much time on this particular story, but let's jump into my first deer. I was about 8 years old. I've got the little plaque hanging up above me now. But tell me exactly what happened on that day and how we went about hunting that deer, because we were both involved. And I remember there was a particular moment where there was a buck chasing a doe, and I don't remember if you shot at that buck or not. But
no, I didn't shoot while you were up there in the stand with me. That year we were living in St. Louis, Missouri, and we would drive, 6, 7, 8 hours down to Vicksburg, and we would hunt with Papa Bear. I think you mentioned Papa Bear on the podcast before.
I mentioned him briefly in passing, but we'll have a whole series on him and all of his exploits. He was a tremendous hunter and a wonderful Southern gentleman.
So Papa Bear had about 300, probably a little over 300 acres north of Natchez, Mississippi. And he had several shooting houses set up and several food plots. He had a really good situation. He was probably 3 miles off the Mississippi River north of Natchez. So we would go to Grammy and Papaw's house there in Vicksburg, and we would meet Papa Bear at a place called Hey Dad's Outdoor World in Vicksburg at 3 o'clock in the morning. And, if Papa Bear told you that he was leaving at 3, if you arrived at 3:01, you arrived 1 minute too late and he was gone. So anyway, we would meet him there and hop in his truck and we would take off and drive. It was probably a little over an hour from Vicksburg to get to the deer camp there. And, it was always fun because if you counted a lot of deer en route to the deer camp, you knew you weren't going to see anything that morning because they were moving before daylight. If you didn't see any deer, you're fixing to be in for a good time because they would move after daylight. So that morning, I remember we didn't count hardly any deer at all. I mean, maybe 10 or 15 over an hour and a half drive. And we get to the camp, and you're a little 8-year-old kid. We climb up in the shooting house, and that was a lot of fun too because his steps were far apart. I think he did that to keep old decrepit people from getting in his shooting houses or something. But anyway, you and I climbed up, and you made it for a while there. Back then we didn't have cell phones and video games in the shooting house with us, so you didn't really have anything to entertain you. So after about an hour or so, you laid down in the floor, and probably within 2 or 3 minutes, you were snoring. Well, we would always time our hunts there during the rut because we didn't want to drive that far to not be able to bring some meat home with us. And sure enough, that year, our timing was just right. Mine was anyway. You were still dreaming in the bottom of the shooting house, but I heard a doe coming through the woods. And, during the rut, when they're chasing theirs, they just make all kinds of noise. It sounded like a bulldozer coming through. And I started kicking you, trying to get you up. And, sure enough, you roused up and sat up. And about that time, what we thought was a little doe come running out in the field. And I told you, I said, hold on the shoulder and just squeeze. And you were aiming, looking through the scope. I think you were shooting a 243 that Papa Bear owned.
Yeah, that was one of his old Winchester Model 70s. A beautiful gun.
So you're looking through the scope, and I'm like, are you aiming on him, or are you on the shoulder? And you said, I see hair, and pulled the trigger. and I could tell you hit the deer. The deer took off. It probably went 30 yards. It didn't go anywhere. But we sat there for, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 minutes just to give it time. And we climbed down. And I told you, at this point, I think you're getting a little disgruntled. You're thinking you didn't hit the deer. And I'm playing along with you. I didn't want you to get overly excited. So we climbed down and we started easing our way towards the deer. And I'm telling you, sometimes you just don't hit it. Sometimes your luck just doesn't go your way. You just don't make a good shot. And I'm just adding to your dismay. And we walk, I don't know, 40, 50 yards, and you could see that white belly. And I look at you, and you hadn't seen it yet. And I said, hey, what's that over there? And you say, hey, that's it. You took off running.
Yeah, that was a cool hunt. I specifically remember getting out of the floor. I don't know. I thought there was a pair of deer that ran by us first.
Oh, I think there were too.
So I think you got me up at that moment. I got up and saw them maybe as they were cresting the edge of the field before they dropped back down. But I laid back down on the floor, if I remember right. He had to wake me back up because I fell asleep in the next minute or so. And I remember seeing this deer. I remember saying that I see hair. And I don't know if this is accurate or not, but I remember, for some reason in my mind, it may have been a dream, but I distinctly remember as the hair on the shoulder passed a tree, an old oak tree, I squeezed the trigger as the crosshairs were centered on that shoulder. Now, I could have been imagining that situation. Who knows? All I know is where I remember shooting at that deer is where the bullet hit. And I don't know who had the camera. Maybe Papa Bear did, but I don't think we had a camera on that hunt that we brought along. And I was pretty disappointed for years and years. And just this past few months, digging through some old photographs, I found a picture of that deer.
Yeah, I remember the picture you're talking about. You had on your little camouflage coveralls.
Yeah, look right in front of you.
Oh, yeah, there it is.
I've got it framed up on the corner of my desk along with a little redfish I caught down at the beach. But cool memories there.
Yeah, man, you put a good shot on that deer. I think you shot 19 deer before you ever missed one, didn't you?
I did, and the first deer I missed was at White Hill Farms version 1 in Egypt, Mississippi. There was about 400 plus acres of land that was purchased by Uncle Stephen, or Dr. Farmer, and Papa Bear went on to manage that property later on. It was a deer paradise. But the first deer I missed came out 450 yards, and I was so confident that I could hit that thing. I squeezed off a shot. I probably hit 3 foot low, and that deer looked back. It had no idea what happened, and I was humbled pretty quick because up to that point I had never missed. That deer had no idea what took place, and I was no longer the top dog in the woods, so I had to take a step back and revamp my approach to shooting deer.
Yeah, the only way you'll never miss a deer, or any animal for that matter, is if you never pull the trigger.
With those deer stories behind us, let's take a step back for a minute and look at some of our lessons learned this past deer season. Was there anything in particular that caught you off guard or changed your way of thinking this year in the deer woods?
Well, the wind, yeah, I got to pay more attention to the wind. And, nowadays we have many things that we can rely on to tell us what the wind is doing. But, I'm following your lead now and throwing that, what is it we throw in the air?
Are you talking about those milkweed pods that float on the breeze?
Yeah, that milkweed really helps you because when you look at the wind pattern on, say, windy.com or what's the other thing we use?
Onyx? It's not the best tool in the world for wind, but it does show a general direction.
Right, but neither one of them really show you what the wind is doing in the woods where you're sitting. Now you can watch the deer. I got spotted. I don't know 4 or 5 times this year. I got blown cover because of scent with deer coming out, and that was even after I was trying to use the wind to my advantage.
Yeah, what I've realized with the wind, there's a place on the northeast end of the property where we have deer cross almost every day. It's a pretty easily identifiable trail, but the trouble that we have is on the north wind, if you sit on the bottom of that ravine, on the south side of that little ravine, common sense would tell you that your wind, the wind would blow your scent further south and it would go away from you. But what happens is that ravine drops off from an upper ridge, and that wind crosses that upper ridge and makes kind of an inverted whirlpool in the air, and it pulls your scent back up the hill. I don't know if you paid attention to that this year, but
Well, maybe that's how I got busted a time or two, and I thought I was taking advantage of the wind.
yeah, it's frustrating. In order to hunt that spot, you have to sit 150 yards or more from the bottom of that ridge so that the wind has time to calm down and keep blowing. Something else I learned with the wind was using the milkweed pods and all of that good stuff. I bought a gallon of milkweed pods on Etsy, I think it was, for $12. And it's a compressed gallon, so this stuff will last a lifetime. Because I have so much of it, I'll throw a handful of it out every so often when I'm hunting. And you can see from, let's say, 0 to 50 yards, you have a scent cone that disperses in a fairly narrow band on a good steady wind. But once you get past about 50 or 60 yards, that scent cone seems to expand exponentially. So this year it seemed like I was busted more between 100 and 150 yards than I was at 20 yards with the wind.
That's probably right.
It was a little bit funky, but it gave us something to think about and consider for next year. Now, aside from the wind, I know a lot of people try to combat that with cover scents or different things there. I know you seem to be a pretty firm believer in either Tink 69 or the Indian buck lure.
Yeah, it's easy to find. It's easy to get. You can buy it at any outdoor store. Whether or not it works, I really have no idea.
I don't know either. I don't think it hurts, but I've gotten away from trying to use a lot of that, but I also kind of using voodoo magic. I have a gallon bag of the Sam's Club baking soda in my hunting box. And when I pull my clothes out of the box, it looks a little bit sketchy while I dust off the white powder.
Yeah, I've taken mine before and put them in there with pine cones, green pine cones, and pine needles and all that sort of stuff. And I think that kind of thing helps you.
I do too. I didn't do that this year. Last year I took some cedar shavings from some wood projects and used that, but this year I didn't do anything.
But my favorite cover scent, skunk scent.
Nasty.
It works.
Yeah, that's something that we didn't mention in my first deer story there when you told it, but We put skunk scent on our clothes, on our boots as a cover scent. The intent was to, and it may have been a joke, but the intent was to say, hey, deer are drawn to the smell of a skunk because they're curious as to what that skunk was spraying at. And that's the one scent that seems to work pretty well. The issue here in South Alabama, close to the Gulf Coast, is that we don't have any skunks hardly.
Yeah, we don't have as many. I had skunk scent on my first bow kill when I killed that 10-point. My buddy there was a firm believer. He's the one that introduced me to skunk scent. And a skunk scent is hard to find, but when you find it, those deer for some reason love to come seek out what caused that skunk to spray.
They do. That's the only scent that I really like over everything else. And it's the one scent that brings back memories, really good childhood memories, including a time when I had to evacuate the school building because I took skunk scent to the school in St. Louis, Missouri as a show and tell item. Apparently, they weren't quite as receptive to the redneck nature of Mississippi folks, and I think it was third grade. I opened my little bag, my Ziploc bag of skunk scent, opened the first bag, opened the second bag, and I opened the third bag. See, I was smart enough to put it in 5 different Ziploc bags layered. By the time I got to the second to last bag, the teacher walked up and took the item out of my hands, my show and tell item. They were concerned that it was a little bit of an issue having a smelly item in class, right? As anybody would be worried. Well, the teacher took it, asked what it was, and before I could answer, the teacher opened the first bag, and that's when the room pretty much blew up with skunk. And like I said, they called the office, I guess, and evacuated the whole wing of the school and sent us outside until our parents could come pick us up.
Yeah, and you didn't get in trouble for it because you really didn't do anything wrong, but I think they did end up evacuating that whole section of the school there.
They didn't. The sad thing about it is there was only a Q-tip sized drop of skunk juice in that little bag.
Oh yeah, it was just tiny.
But all that to say, between the wind and various cover scents, playing the wind is critical, and then if you like cover scents, using an effective cover scent that you have confidence in, I think is key. The skunk scent works for us, so we use that. But the sad thing as well is I can't keep it in the house anymore because my wife won't let me store it in the refrigerator.
I just keep mine in my hunting backpack, and my wife doesn't even know it's there. Maybe she's just used to smelling me all the time. I don't know.
You and the southern skunk ape, both.
That's right.
We'll cover food plots a little bit more this summer in detail, but what is it that you have in mind regarding our spring plots and the soybeans that you mentioned earlier?
Well, we've got some more oaks. The land we have up there, when we first acquired it, 3 or 4 years ago, it's a pine plantation, had very few mast crops on it. We do have some oaks, and those deer were under those oaks all the time. Unfortunately, they're not real big oaks.
Yeah, they're southern red oaks and water oaks, so they're not even all that appreciated by the deer. The deer eat them because that's what they have, but they're not ideal for our particular area as far as mast crops go.
Yeah, and the people that had the lease on the property before it was purchased, they had several food plots. So, we maintain the food plots, but we've also planted, I don't know how many oak trees, sawtooth oaks, Chinese chestnuts, in an effort to make sure the deer and the turkey have plenty of mass to chew on. This year we also planted persimmons, plums, and wild blackberry. By the way, we purchased those from Mossy Oak Native Nurseries. If you go online, you can Google Native Nurseries, NATIV Nurseries, and they have great prices. The plants were shipped. I received them the day after I requested they be shipped, and they came in and looked great. So anyway, we planted those. We planted some blueberry bushes, just again trying to feed the deer and the turkey. We've got some wild oaks. I guess they're swamp oaks that we planted in the fall.
That's right. Yeah, I've got about 55 swamp white oaks that are growing. They're actually outside now, acclimatizing to the spring weather, but yeah.
And, we'll put those out too. And this summer, I would like to plant some corn up there. And I think I'm going to plant some soybeans just to give the deer something to feed on during the summer months.
Yeah, something I want to try, and we haven't done this yet. I've been a little bit lazy on getting around to it, but I want to try either is it no-till method, the no-disc method. So far, we've been disking everything up in the fall, preparing the soil beds and seeding, and then covering those seeds. But I've heard some different ideas on how to go about building your topsoils and all of that good stuff. So we may try spraying this year with, I guess, atrazine. We'll have to do some looking into what the best spray is, but do some spraying and cutting and either trying the no-till method or doing more of a shallow disc, like scarification, when we plant those seeds.
Our buddies, Tom and Dane Ellison, and Ethan, they hunt an hour and a half north of us, but several years ago, they switched over to that no-till method. And I saw one of their food plots a year or so ago. I was up there with Tom and it really looked good.
Yeah, they have gorgeous food plots. Something that they do, I guess they just spray it. So let me back up. It's not something they do, but something I've seen people do is they'll take a seed crimper, like a 6-foot wide crimper roller, and use that instead of cutting the actual grasses down in the fall before they plant. That seed crimper kills the various vegetation by basically breaking it every 6 inches or so. It prevents the moisture from climbing that stalk and giving nutrition to those particular grasses. So I've priced out seed crimpers. I've looked them up, and they are far more expensive than any set of discs that we can buy right now, any other implements. So if anybody out there has a seed crimper in South Alabama, not a seed crimper, a roller crimper, I'd be more than happy to consider renting it from you.
Yeah, maybe they could just store it at our place for a little while.
And that sounds good to me.
The best story from Tom and Dane Ellison is your beaver story, but that's probably worthy of its own show.
Oh, man. Yeah, we're going to get into some mountain man history in a few episodes, and when we do, I'll have to get Tom to tell the story of that beaver trapping adventure and how we met for the first time. Well, guys, we've talked about our first deer kills, a first bow kill, and we've examined our past deer season, including playing the wind and using cover scents. We've also talked about skunk juice and what you should and shouldn't do with that regarding school. I'll go to my grave under the opinion that playing the wind is more important than a cover scent, but as mentioned earlier, an effective cover scent is one that you have confidence in. As we approach turkey season, our attention is going to be taken away from deer season for a little while. But once we get back into our habitat management and our food plot development for the summer and the fall, we'll really dig into these different concepts of planting and what our plan is for this next year. Thank you again, Dad, for joining me on this podcast. I sure hope that you've enjoyed this week's episode. I've put the Native Nurseries link in the show description as well as a link to Wendy.com and Onyx. We do not have any sponsors at this time, but I've been thrilled with the quality of service from Native Nurseries, as well as Wendy.com and Onyx. As a side note, we planted some trees last year from Native Nurseries. They were about 16 inches tall when they were put in the ground, and by this spring, they've exceeded 5 feet, and it's been incredible to watch the growth. Tune in next week to hear about our wood duck hunting adventures in the Delta. This will be a show that you will not want to miss. If you have any questions or comments, reach out to me via Spotify Podcast or Apple Podcast. Please provide us feedback so that we can continue to develop our show for you, and remember to share us with your friends and follow and rate us as we grow. Love in Christ.